Hello and welcome to Fighting 15s. I'm about to hopefully demonstrate how to lay out a mould using low temperature silicone. These are cream silicone discs from J. Coker's of Faversham, and you can cure them at 85 degrees centigrade in a vulcanizing press, which helps minimise shrinkage. I think they're recommended at about 110, but you'll get about 4 to 5% shrinkage if you do that. If you cure them at 85, you'll actually get about 1 to 2% shrinkage, which is a huge improvement. So first of all, I'm going to take one of the halves and approximately mark where the centre is using a previous mould, and I'm going to just press down with the mushroom from the mould can, and it will leave a nice impression there. I'm also at this point going to mark with a compass an impression which will give me something to place the horses which I'm going to make in this mould along, so I get about 15 to 16 horses in the mould, and I'm going to mark some inner lines for cutting guidelines later. Alright, so that's that. It's just approximate. You can do it completely freehand, in which case you may make a complete mess of getting it off centre at some point, but it doesn't really matter. Right, the mould can, I use a little muslin sheet tied up and filled with talc to dust, a newspaper liner, which I've already cut the hole out of. You can create the liner by placing the top of a mould can on top of a sheet of newspaper and cutting around it with a sharp knife like a scalpel. So that liner helps take the mould out of the mould can. My mould can, although it's bolted together and you could take it apart, I've never have, and you just deal with it as it is. Right, I'm now going to take off the protective liners from the silicone. Just chuck them away carefully somewhere unimportant, and now it's important to talc the mould. There's a few little bits of, so you can just, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a bit of polishing there. Where's all the lines there? I need first, before I talc mould, to cut out this little central bit for the mould mushroom to go into in a minute. So normally I'd have done this before, but I forgot. And approximately the other side. Some silicone comes with a hole pre-stamped, which is great, it's nice and convenient, but then you don't have a central wodge of silicone to put a compass on. And so I'm also operating at a funny angle to try to show this better on camera. So I have no idea how this will come out. So there we are, that's should allow the mushroom to go through in a minute. Right, I'm just going to go off camera for a moment and dust the top and the edge. I'm not going to dust the bottom because it's got that paper liner to in the bottom of the mould, and I actually want the paper to stick to the silicone, so excuse me a moment. Alright, so that's dusted. I normally do this over a box, so that the talc falls into the box. It's important to use asbestos-free talc, which I believe most of them are, but always got to check. That's actually quite loose. It's obviously quite cold today. Then you put that down and give it a good press. And then the most important thing after you put your mushroom in is to remember your nuts. So I use some square mould locator nuts. These are from hewitt-impex. I found these are absolutely the best mould locator nuts, and I use about a dozen in a mould, and I use the bolt holes to line them up for the first three. Then I place opposite one to the there, so that's 6 in, and then I put 6 more in, and I turn these through so they're on the diagonal. And the idea is these stop the mould slipping when you're casting it later. And these square ones really do lock the mould quite well, and I've seen very little mould slip as a result of using these. Okay, that's those in. You've got to leave a little bit between there and the edge. And then what I do is I put a marker nut in. This is one of a smaller one I've got. I push it in there. That's in case, in the unlikely event that all 12 location nuts end up in exactly the same position evenly around the mould, that you can't put the mould together any other way than that way, because that little locator nut stops it, and I tend to push that one in. You can see I've marked the top of the mould. This says spins. This is to remind, because this is laid top down. So what I'm doing is the top of a mould. We'll put the bottom of the mould on top in a minute. I've labelled it spins because my casting machine spins clockwise. So if you inverted that, that would be where it's. And then a reminder that tails and bayonets, which tend to go out like that, should point that way in the mould, so that when the mould spins, the metal is forced into the bits that are hardest to cast. But these are horses. Now, I'm actually remaking a mould, so this is one of the previous versions of this horse mould, and you notice this is the top. The tails are actually pointing that way. There's a little bit of an inward direction from the tail there, which means the metal will be hard to get them in there, and the heads are facing that way. So the difficult to cast bit there is actually going where all the metal will end up. So I'm just going to roughly position the horses. I have to think about this, which way round they have to face as you go around the mould, and I'm using that outer guideline I put in, which you won't be able to see very easily, just to give me an idea of where to put the horses to keep them evenly spaced from the centre. I'm going to have put as many in as I can. I like to have my figures in fairly central in the run, because I find that's the easiest way of controlling the pressure on them when casting. It's if you put things with a large edge out towards the back, like there, you need more pressure to seal the mould when you're casting, and if you don't, they'll flash more easy. So in here, it's a balance. You want maximum force going out to cast the metal into the cavity, but you also don't want it to flash. So we're going to have a little play. I think there's probably room to get another horse in if I just move them carefully around. You're obviously trying to make a mould that's as efficient as possible for casting, so you get as many figures off every time you do a spin. But also, you've got to allow for some working room for cutting vents, and if you're new, you want more space. So I would actually, for a starter mould, I wouldn't put as many horses into this one. I'm just positioning before you press this down into the silicone. You just make sure they're all sort of evenly spaced using that guide. So there's 2 more guides there, and what I'm going to do later is cut a channel like there is there, and I'm going to use that as a guide to where they are. So I think that's just about right. And so how many got? 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. So it's not as, it's probably 17 in the other one. It's not as many as I could get in there, but that's what I'm happiest with. And the size of a locator nut means actually I can't put them too far out. It's for one disadvantage of having large nuts, if you were. Right, so I'm just going to press down. Ideally, use this as a marker for starting all your operations. So you start there, you go round. It doesn't really matter at this stage. Give them a good press, so they're about halfway in. There's quite a bit of resistance. One of the advantages about silicone mould, it's very easy to lay out because it's soft. Conventional rubber needs to soften in the eye. If you could do this with black rubber by warming it up first on the vulcanizer while that's on. My vulcanizer is currently on and getting up to temperature. So that's all those. So a check. I've got the mushroom in there to form the cavity for pouring metal into. I've got the locator nuts, so it'll all work and everything's in. So that's fine. So now that was my guide onto how to put a hole. All right, the other discs. I'm going to strip the plastic off. One thing I don't like about the Cocos mould is this plastic, because it's quite thin and it tears, and you can leave little bits of white plastic on the rubber, which can cause a few problems. Doesn't really matter on the edge, but I've had recently a piece stick in the middle of the mould. I couldn't see it because it was white on cream, and it basically went across one of the figures. So that wasn't very good. So that's right. There's a bit of plastic stuck to my hand. Right. Next stage is to talc this. So again, I'll just go off camera and talc this over a box. And this time I'm talking both sides and the edges, so that it doesn't stick one to the mould can, and more importantly, it doesn't stick to the other mould half. The talc is the thing that's keeping these two halves separate. Don't use silicone spray. Silicone spray will just cause things to stick together if you're using silicone. Right, so I should say there's, on a mould, there's usually on a disc, there's a straighter edge and a curved edge. You want the curvier edges to the outside and the flatter edges to the where the moulds meet. It'll just create a far neater mould. Basically, this curve will get forced into the mould corners anyway. Otherwise, you can end up with a lip. If you put the two curved bits together, you can get one of them lipping over the other, and it creates quite a difficult mould sometimes. Right, what I'm going to do, turn this upside down. You can see in the top of the mould can, there's the location cavity. This creates a nice little rubber lug which locates to the casting machine and centres the mould each time. I wouldn't do without this, but the trouble is this can trap air, and you have to create some vents in this top disc to avoid that. So we're going to put that on there for a moment, and somewhere I've got a steel ruler which I'm just going to do I'm going to push there. I'm just going to push in the centre and a push there, and I'm just going to reinforce the dent in the centre. Now that's going to get flipped over, so that little cavity will be over there, and any air will get forced down towards the edges. And because we also can trap air between the two moulds halves, we're going to, let's see if this shows, nick tiny notch in the mould there, and I'll leave there, and this will allow any air to go out through there, any air trapped in there to escape somewhere, because this can all fit quite tightly together, and you can seal, in effect the silicone will seal the edges and trap air, so that gives air a chance to escape and will sort of help your moulds form a lot better. Now I'm just going to top up the talcing on the mould face. Again, I would normally do this over a box, give it a bang, and then locate that over there, press down over the horse halves, for horses, so that they don't shift, 'cause things can get loose and move around. You don't want that to happen, and discover that your beautiful mould has a piece that's gone wonky. Okay, and then finally the mould top, give a quick dusting too. So I don't need to put a newspaper sheet on this half, because actually I tend to use the stickiness or suction on here to pull the mould out of a can at the right temperature. Doesn't always work, but it's nice if it does. And again, you turn that over, and I've got the locator there. I always, absolutely always, lay my moulds out with the 2 locator studs there, with little one and the big one, and there. The mould halves are marked on the edges by the manufacturer with the dot, so you can always align this. And I always do it the same way, so all my moulds will end up aligned the same way. And similarly, this end always goes to the back of the vulcanizer. Right, so I'm going to close up the mould, just give it a little press, so that's and that's it. I'm going to take it to the vulcanizer and put it in for 5 hours at 85 degrees. The lower the temperature, for much longer time you require to absolutely vulcanise the mould, and I could get away with about 4 hours, but 5 hours is certainty. The old formulation for this cream silicone from Coker's used to require you to post-cure it with heat anyway for several hours after the initial vulcanisation, so part of this is a legacy of that. So there we are. Next time we'll come back, take this out of a can and show you how to cut the mould.